Hi everyone, it's Philip here, and while we're in the Lenten season, I just want to talk a little bit about what Lent is and address one of the kind of key issues that I think comes up when we talk about something like Lent and other spiritual practices. Something that I think kind of shuts down conversation, shuts down an idea that might be really helpful for us, and it's probably a misunderstanding about discipleship generally. So I introduced Lent to the church. I think I introduced it anyway, but certainly I raised it as a practice that we could adopt as a church, or at least invite whoever wanted to do it in the church, and faced a range of different views on it, I suppose, and responses to it. On one hand, you've got those who are very suspicious about anything that has to do or appears to be a Catholic practice, and believe that Catholicism is deeply flawed, and so they won't touch anything that they think is a Catholic practice. You've got others who are, and by Catholic I mean Roman Catholic, by the way, just sort of clarify that. You've got others who just don't know about it at all. They're not familiar with those kinds of terms. They're not familiar with Lent and various other old practices like that. They weren't trained, they weren't taught. And then you've got another group of people for whom they're interested in it, they're intrigued in it, maybe even already doing it on their own, and perhaps quite up for responding to it. So what is Lent? And to me, I'm not an expert on Lent, but I don't believe it's a very complicated idea. It's essentially this. So every year the church calendar has in its place, and by church calendar you could simply say, well, every year we celebrate Easter and we celebrate Christmas. Let's look at those two main events as kind of keys to the church calendar. In preparing for something like Easter, you could, of course, just do 4 days. You know, the 4 holidays, if you like, that we celebrate in New Zealand, and say, well, that's Easter. But how do you prepare for that? As a Christian, you don't have to prepare for that particularly hard as a member of New Zealand society. All you might need to do is just book some holidays, right? You could just book your time at the beach. But if you're a Christian, and for you, the central defining character of who you are trying to become is Christ, then how would you prepare yourself for that incredible event of the cross and resurrection? Would you just casually walk up to that time period and just hope that you're ready for it? Would you be like every other New Zealand citizen and book a time at the beach and say, well, Easter's just a time for me to have more time for myself? Is that how a Christian prepares themselves to become more like Christ? And that would seem to me a fairly common response, actually, that, well, we just go on holiday. It's a good chance for me to get a break. And I'm not, if you need a break, take a break. Easter may not be the best time for that, though I understand why a lot of people do. You know, you've got a public holiday either side of a weekend. It's, you know, for the sake of 4 days, you kind of get, 8 days holiday. That said, is it the best way that we prepare ourselves to become Christ-like? Now, whether you're an evangelical or a Catholic or whatever you are, the goal of a Christian, clearly defined in Scripture, is to become more Christ-like. That Christ is formed in us. That's the purpose of the Spirit of God given to us all, not to give us special powers, not to grant us immunity from death and entry into heaven. It is to make us like Christ. That's what it is. Now, all of those other things are secondary benefits, if you like. It is about making Christ-like character in us, making us into Christ, forming Christ in us. And we know what Christ was like by the Gospels. We know what he taught. We know how he behaved. We know the key events that defined his life. That's where the church calendar comes from the key events that defined the life of Christ. And the Lenten journey is a way of saying the key event of the Easter season, the cross and resurrection, was achieved by a journey that took Jesus to that point. And we can go on a truncated version of that every year by doing a 40-day journey to Easter, and And in that journey, we'll do something that Jesus was doing in preparing himself for the cross. He was preparing himself to give his body as a sacrifice to everyone else. So to prepare ourselves to receive that incredible sacrifice of Christ, we might do something that would look a little similar. And I will say only a little similar because, we can make a great deal of fuss about fasting, but we are not people being nailed to a cross. So let's not get too carried away about the cost that we might be bearing in Lent. So fasting was a common one. And it was a way of bringing the body into the story of our discipleship. It was a way of saying Christianity can't just be thoughts in my head. It can't just be unseen or unheard prayers. Where is my body? Because Jesus walked the earth in a body. He gave his body up in sacrifice to us. In what way are we giving our body in sacrifice and willingly offering our body to Christ in service? So it's a way of training us in that. And fasting was a common one. And I think it was often just eating vegetables, plain vegetables and rice, for instance. And then on Sunday you had a day off, so you could have a full roast meal if you wanted. But that was one of the common ways to embrace Lent, to bring the body into the picture. But there's lots of different practices, and you can go online and find all those. There's no point me going on about those here. But the idea was, I want to follow in the footsteps of my Lord. I want to become more like him by entering into his life and the journey he took to some small degree, so that every year I increasingly am prepared for Easter, this world-defining moment. And the pushback around Lent tends to be a misunderstanding of that. It tends to be something like, I'm saved by grace. I cannot do anything to save myself. There was an unbridgeable gap between me and God, between humanity and God, that only God could have bridged, and he did that through Jesus Christ. There is an unpayable debt between humanity and God that God alone could pay, and he paid it through the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I'm absolutely all for that. That's absolutely true. And they go further to say, I must be sure not to even try to pay that debt, lest I make a mockery of that same sacrifice of Jesus. If I try to, and this is very Pauline thinking, if I try to gain favor with God by the things that I do, and try and put God into my debt by doing great things in God's name, then I have misunderstood grace. I have tried to use my works as a substitute for Christ's death and resurrection. And I totally agree with that too. That's absolutely true. And we are all of us guilty of doing that in numerous ways. But that doesn't mean that we Christians aren't called to do something as a part of our faith. That to say that you cannot and should not try to earn your place in God's kingdom is utterly true. Absolutely. To say that being in God's kingdom requires no commitment or no sacrifice, no discipline, is utterly false. Christ calls us to live a certain kind of life that he defines as take up your cross and follow me. Now, it's broad enough in its description so that there is no one thing that anyone could say, that's your cross, like as if to say that everyone has the same cross and we're supposed to be carrying the same cross. There are some common things, I think caring for the widows and orphans, which would probably come at some personal cost. There might be something that you would have to give to them, and that's a cost because you no longer have it. But it's a common call, right? I think I might have mentioned this last time. James says that the religion that God affirms is caring for the widows and orphans and the strangers among us. So there is a burden of responsibility on anyone who says they're following Jesus Christ to back that up with genuine action. Not because we are trying to win favor with God, and not because we don't think that Christ's sacrifice was fully complete and sufficient, but because believing that to be true places us under even greater debt to Jesus to do something in his name, not just speak his name. I can't remember where I heard it, but I remember a story being told about someone being explained, what grace means and what grace is about. And this was new to the person. And as they understood and grew in an understanding of what grace was about and what Christ had done for them, they grew kind of horrified because they realized that the burden placed on them because of the grace of God for their life, that if Christ has given this for them, freely given, and it's their free gift to receive, they recognize quite intelligently that it comes with a high price. It comes with the price of only one thing, really, and that's entirely our lives. We cannot say Jesus Christ is Lord, that he has paid for the sins of all, that we owe him total fealty, and then go and live as if that's not true, as if Jesus Christ is not Lord of our lives. He is Lord of our eternal destiny, and we'll meet him one day. But meanwhile, now that I've got that ticket secured to heaven, I go and live as I please. I don't know too many Christians who think like that, frankly. But it's odd to me that whenever we start to talk about something that we might do that would help us step in closer alignment with the way that Jesus lived and the things that Jesus valued and the example that Jesus left us, that we would decide to say that that's legalism or that's a dangerous attempt to pay our way into heaven. It's not that at all. It's not. Hey, look, fair enough. If that is true for some people, then we should rightly point that out and say that's not a healthy way about going about a spiritual practice. But spiritual practices like Lent are not intended to buy our way into heaven, to purchase our place with God, to put him in our debt. They are designed to help us come into a closer alignment with the Spirit of God by setting aside some of the busyness and activity of our world and our this massive distraction network that we live in. Every screen that we have. I love to read books, and whether it be a hard copy or a soft copy. I was going to reach for a book, or on Kindle. Books are incredible, and I love them, but they also can be distracting. Books can be, even if it's a theological book, can be a substitute for sitting quietly with God. Spiritual practices, put it this way. Here's a couple of ways to think about spiritual practices. When I buy flowers for my wife, unless it's because I've done something horribly wrong and I'm trying to curry favor with her, most of the time it's because I know she loves flowers. And, flowers are not my thing, but they're her thing. So I buy her flowers because I want to please her. I want her to feel joy. That becomes my heart desire, to bring joy to my wife and to value something that she values. And it comes at a cost because flowers aren't cheap. And for me, flowers are those kinds of things which are nice to have, but they do rot quite quickly. And so, you end up throwing away the money that you put into it. But that's something she values. And because of that, I value it and I value her having them. So I make it a priority to make sure she has flowers. Am I trying to buy favor with my wife? No, I'm trying to love my wife. Maybe that's a sufficient example, I think. And you could probably put your own particular spin on that. But grace is an act of God's love for us. And love is the only debt that Paul talks about we're supposed to have. The debt of love to one another because of the debt of love we have with God. And guess what? The debt of love is much higher and much more demanding than legalism ever will be. It's not a debt you can ever pay off, nor should you ever want to be paid off. You always want to be in debt, a love debt with people. I'm in a love debt to my wife. She has done such wonderful things for us as a family and for me personally. And I'll never be able to pay back what she has given to us. I'm in a love debt to friends and colleagues in church. Well, you guys, the love that you've shown me as a fumbling, bumbling pastor, I can never pay that back. And that's the only debt we're supposed to have left to us. And it's one we're to continually invest in and never hope to pay off. because you never want to get to a point where you say, well, I owe you nothing out of love, because that's missing the point. So that's what the spiritual practices are for me. That's what Lent is for me. It is a way of entering into the steps with Christ that bring me closer to the heart of Christ, which brings me closer into the love of God's heart for us, which means that when I get to Easter, I know a little more what it feels like to be in love with Christ and to receive Christ's love for us. So legalism? I don't think so. Dangerous? Absolutely, because it just might change your life. Anyway, those are my thoughts. God bless. I'll see you soon. Peace.